Welcome to our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion, Expanding Katie's Canon, Antiracist Teaching for Transformation. Sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Our panelists are Dr. Rebecca Davis, Associate Professor of Christian Education at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and Dr. Rochelle White, Professor of Youth Ministry and Director of Field Practicum and Internships at Kuiper College. Our host and moderator is the Reverend Melanie C. Jones, Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and Instructor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Before we begin, we invite you to watch this short video appreciation of Dr. Cannon's pedagogy.
I'm working on womanist pedagogy. Last year, when the American Academy of Religion awarded me the Teacher of the Year award, it was one of the greatest honors I've ever been bestowed upon me, because I've been teaching since I was 3 years old. I started school when I was 3 at Mount Calvary Lutheran Kindergarten. And my sisters and brothers, my cousins knew that we couldn't do anything until we had school. I had to be the teacher and they had to do homework. So since I was 3, I have been teaching. I've been giving homework. I've been grading papers. So when the American Academy of Religion said, "You are the Teacher of the Year," it confirmed all of what I have loved doing, even more so than being ordained or all the other accolades I've gotten, just the Teacher of the Year. Because I come from a tradition of teachers. My aunts who all went to college were teachers. And I love the Black teaching legacy, and that's what I want to write about, how in the Black educational school process, it was always, I'm going to give you the best I got, and I want you to be better. So it wasn't about trying to destroy or mystify or befuddle people, but really the difference between an educated person and an educated fool. And so that's what I want to write about, is how Black women in particular in that educational heritage have taught me how to be a teacher and how I try to teach it to all the people I mentor.
Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, and I serve as the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. We are so excited to have you join us tonight to talk about a very important topic: expanding Katie's canon, teaching anti-racist teaching for transformation. I never assume in any place, whether it is a physical location or online location, that people know the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon just because I've said her name. But she is a woman of first, the first Black woman ordained in the United Presbyterian Church, as well as the first Black woman to graduate with a PhD from Union Theological Seminary. She is a womanist trailblazer, the first to source Alice Walker's term womanist in the Theological Academy, and the founder of the Center for Womanist Leadership. But what is most important about Dr. Cannon and our reason for gathering tonight is that she was and remains, I believe, a consummate teacher. In her teaching statement, she wrote, quote, "The call to teach is like fire shut up in my bones. As a Christian womanist liberation theological ethicist, embodied mediated knowledge is a fundamental component of my pedagogy. I bring my biotexts, and students bring their existential stories rooted in remembering to the common centering point in each course of study. Working together as co-learners, we introduce into existence new forms of moral praxis." In recent weeks, we have witnessed an increasing interest to not only censor the teaching of Black history and African American studies, but ban books that also feature the stories of many underrepresented populations. These political efforts illuminate what Dr. Cannon coined as, quote, structured academic amnesia that often denies the experiential truths and stories of racialized trauma in this nation. Similarly, the church is not off the hook because it has also sustained a kind of amnesia that conveniently overlooks its participation in sanctioning oppressive theologies. The womanist ethical task, as Canon notes, is debunking, unmasking, and disentangling the ideologies, the theologies, and the systems of valuable operative in a particular society. March is recognized for many of us as Women's Her Story Month. The 2023 National Women's History Alliance, their theme is Celebrating Women Who Tell Our Stories, which highlights and honors brave, accomplished, influential women who told and continue to tell stories. In that same article, structured academic amnesia, as if this true womanist story never happened, Dr. Cannon tells a story of being violated in a New York hotel. And that story, because the hotel was not able to be discovered by journalists, because that record was not kept, that her story was dismissed. In response, she gives us the adage: even if they tell you your truth is a lie, tell it anyway. Tonight, we gather Christian educators as well as former students of Dr. Cannon as we engage lessons from the Canon Womanist classroom and ways we as teachers and learners may expand Katie's canon on anti-racism in our quest to teach for transformation. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Rebecca Davis, who is a minister of word and sacrament and a certified Christian educator in the Presbyterian Church. Before being appointed at Union Presbyterian Seminary as associate professor of religion and director of the Christian education program, she was the associate professor of religion and director of Christian education program at Presbyterian College in Clinton, South Carolina. She brings more than 25 years of congregational experience to her academic teaching, and one of her deepest passions is child advocacy, which called her to serve as coordinator of the Religious Action Division for the Children's Defense Fund and to serve as staff for the National Council of Churches Committee on Justice for Children and Their Families. Welcome, Dr. Davis. Our second guest, last but not least, certainly, is Dr. Rochelle White, who is a lifelong learner and youth advocate. Reverend Dr. Rochelle White is a preacher, a teacher, a writer, a consultant, and a life coach. In addition to serving at Kuyper College, she is an associate minister at First Community African Methodist Episcopal Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she too has served for more than 30 years, children, youth, and young adults as an elementary school teacher, an after-school program coordinator, a teen counselor, a summer camp director, a mentor, a curriculum writer, a youth program director, and a youth pastor. All of these roles contribute to Dr. Rochelle's life mission to assist God's people in discovering their true identity and purpose by introducing resources that lead to continual growth. Welcome, Dr. Rochelle White.
Thank you.
I think we should start our conversation from first impressions. As students of Dr. Cannon, I just want to ask you to reflect on your first time meeting her, or your first impressions, or a memory that you hold dear that you would like to bring forward for us tonight.
Dr. Cannon is real. And so I've been known to be called real as well. So it was a situation where real met real. And what I loved about Dr. Cannon was her easygoing way. She was a person that kept the common touch. Everyone could relate to her because she cared for everyone that she met. So my first impression of Dr. Cannon is that she was real.
She was unwilling to let you bring anything less than your full self. to the classroom, to a relationship, to, research, you name it, whatever it was that she was teaching or mentoring you in, she brought her whole self and she expected you to do the same, and to bring less than who you were created to be in your fullness was not only a disservice to her, but also a disservice to God. And so she brought her best and she expected you to bring your best.
I think you can both relate as students of Dr. Cannon that she not only brought her full self to the classroom, but invited you to bring your embodied self as well. How would you describe Dr. Cannon as a pedagogue or a teacher?
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She was absolutely brilliant in the most practical way.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I loved about Dr. Cannon is that she taught me how to be a teacher before teaching, before she taught me how to be a teacher before I did what a teacher does. So it was about being before it was about doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing she modeled for me as a teacher was boundaries. She modeled authenticity. She, like Dr. Davis said, bringing our best selves. And then when you look at the skills that she taught us and the methodology, it just opened my world up.
Mm-hmm.
The typical graduate classroom is a lecture. We did talking papers, feasibility studies, Annunciation celebration ceremonies, film critiques. We did so much, and it was rigorous. It wasn't dumbed down. So she taught us to think, and to think well. She made a place for everyone. So everyone in the class felt as if they were the only one in the class, because she valued us that much. I would say just her audacity as a Black woman and a minister, all of that she brought to the classroom, and it all impacted me. In fact, Dr. Cannon's teaching gave me life. When I thought that there was no life, when I thought I had to be in the academy and be a certain way, here comes Dr. Cannon.
She had a way of reaching down in you and seeing something that you maybe couldn't see yourself. So she saw the possibilities in us, especially those first years as Dr. Rochelle and I were making our way through PhD programs, we would tend to devalue ourselves because the academy would almost divorce who we were as people and what we brought to the process from what the expectations were for how academics were lived out. And she defied that boldly. And she, in many ways, refused to let us deny that in ourselves as well. So our stories were who we were as people, as practitioners, the experience we had before we came to the PhD program were every bit as important as the texts we were reading in classrooms. And she expected us to bring our full selves, including every single question we could imagine. And she created space for that. In some ways, our experiences were just as important as what was on the syllabus. And that every single class topic that we discussed, everything that we read, was to be put in conversation with equally to what some expert had said. And she teased out, she invited out, she cajoled out of us what we would have to contribute, not someday, but right then and there in that classroom and in that moment.
I think that's fascinating. And I think thinking about her work as an ethicist makes me think that makes me know that she was one who was able to link this kind of continuum, that our thinking and our being and our doing are intertwined, are deeply committed. That is, what we believe is connected to who we are, or at least who we say we are, which is also connected to what we do and how we treat one another and how we practice it in our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Rochelle, you were pointing to methodology models that Canon. I hear the record, appropriation and reciprocity, enunciation and celebration, feasibility study. Can you talk to me about Dr. Cannon as a model? Particularly, how do you understand her pedagogy as a transformative anti-racist methodology?
Sure. Just to highlight the tenets of womanist pedagogy, there are 3 tenets: historical ethos, embodied pathos, and communal logos. And so historical ethos, she talked about how she valued the Black teacher tradition in her teaching her students. And one thing that's crucial with that is memory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we remember the sacrifices of the ancestors who did give us their best. And now it's our turn to give our students their best, give them our best. And so that's historical ethos. Then the second tenet is embodied pathos, where learning is engaged. It's embodied. It's not simply just learning for the sake of learning, but you pair that embodied pathos with historical logos. So you're looking at history and lived experience. Dr. Davis talked about we brought our whole selves. And so we talk about our lived experience, and she taught us to put our lived experiences in conversation with the resources that we were reading. And then there's the communal logos aspect of her pedagogy, which is reciprocity. That in the womanist classroom, it is reciprocal. Dialogue is reciprocal. So students talk to students, students talk to teachers, teachers talk to students, and everybody talks together. And one thing she said that she always said in that particular aspect of womanist pedagogy is that it causes cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And then with that dissonance, we're able to come together and to know one another better, because we are talking from a perspective where everyone's voice matters. So when you look at it from a transformative anti-racist methodology using Dr. Cannon's womanist pedagogy, I would offer the same 3 principles. First being historical ethos, looking at memory, looking at helping people to see racism clearly, basically seeing them to understand the consequences of racism and then oppose it. That will be the memory or the historical ethos part. And you know, it's been said, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So that's why here at Kuiper, in my human diversity class, I require my students to read hard history. Do they like it? Probably not. Do they become uncomfortable? I'm sure they are. They're angry. They're disgusted. They find it difficult to read. Sometimes they see themselves, they see their families, they see their ancestors. But one thing they're doing in that process is witnessing the consequences of racism and basically identifying new ways of thinking by engaging with others. So that would be the first part of the historical ethos. And then there's the embodied pathos, which is the embodied or engaged learning, where I help facilitate them in teaching themselves what they need to know. Because Dr. Cannon always said we don't need any more disembodied talking heads. So I design my requirements that they get involved and get embodied and engaged. And one thing Dr. Cannon said she's going to do is introduce students to traditional male thinkers, because that's normative. And then second, give students the opportunity to look at the African-American Christian experience and faith. And then also to introduce students to authors of color and people who have diverse perspectives as a part of that embodied pathos, because it causes them to grow. It causes them to engage in ways and explore things and situations that they would not normally do. For example, I'm having my students this semester read both of Patrick Riaz's books, The Purpose Gap and
Yeah.
Nobody Cries When We Die.
Yeah.
And it's been transformative. We finished the book today, and it was just transformative what the students have taken away from that book. And so that would be the embodied pathos. And then finally is the communal logos, where there's reciprocity, where we all talk together, where we become upset with one another at times, but we also come forward and understanding and empathy. And by building constructive dialogues, it's a safe space. This communal, when we talk about communal logos, it has to be a safe space to build trust and grow in diversity consciousness. So that's how I think Dr. Cannon's womanist pedagogy can engage us in a transformative anti-racism pedagogy expertise. Excuse me. I'm good.
No, that's awesome. I think you teased that out just fabulously, connecting that historical ethos, embodied pathos, communal logos, three central kind of ways by which we understand that thinking, being, and doing, as I just said before, but also ways in which they require us to remember, to also be aware of what is in front of us in terms of how we present our own embodiment, and then also to connect that back to our communities. Fascinating. Thank you. I have a video that I want to bring into our conversation today from one of our students that talks a little bit about what she's learning from Dr. Cannon's legacy in terms of transformation.
I have had the pleasure of working with two feminists here at UPSTEM who were mentored by Dr. Cannon. And I dare say her influence on them makes me smile, because it shows that there was such a depth of her as an individual, as a professor, as a friend, that she impacted not just women who look like me, but that she impacted women who don't look like me, and she impacted others. So in terms of a tool from her toolbox, I'm just learning about her toolbox, but what I see is the result of the things that she did, that she was able to cultivate in women. It didn't matter what they looked like, but she was able to cultivate a sense of pride and understanding. And those two professors have given me space to just be who I am. And I appreciate that. So I don't know what tool was in the toolbox, but what I can tell you is that her impact is expansive.
I think that's a perfect segue to you, Dr. Davis. We could talk about womanism, right, as a prophetic social movement, as an approach that attends to the survival and liberation of Black women. But it is also an anti-oppressionist paradigm that is intended to have universal imports. And Dr. Davis, how does Dr. Cannon's vision of womanism, is it expansive? How is its expansiveness resonate with communities and contexts beyond Black women?
Thank you, Reverend Melanie. It absolutely does. As in predominantly white classrooms, or let's say dominant cultural classrooms, there is an expectation of passivity, and of not questioning what we're taught. And I think that what Dr. Cannon's womanist pedagogical approach does is it asks each of us, particularly those of us who are white and who come to not ever be able to say that we are womanists, but womanist allies, and teach with womanist sensibilities, is to say that we have a responsibility to unmask those power structures. We have a responsibility to decide what kind of participant we will be, because we can be passive participants where we do not interrupt the logic, where we just simply accept what has come before and the dominant story that we're told. Or we can become active folks who are engaged in interrupting the logic, who are listening, not just learning to listen to our own stories, but listening to our sisters' stories, and hearing one another. Nell Morton, hearing one another into being. It is a privilege to sit and listen and to get to know and to build relationships across whatever divide this world would foster. And I think the pedagogies and the ways in which Dr. Cannon taught us brings forth a responsibility in each of us to create the kind of space that Daphne was talking about, so that we can begin to see where we are in that story, and to how do we interrupt the logic? How do we construct a world where we are embodied, where we are integrated, where we are living into our full humanity with ourselves, but also with each other. So in my classes, when I was at Presbyterian College, which was quite a little bubble place, I taught a class on womanist, feminist, liberation, theopedagogies. And when I came to the seminary, I needed to make a decision because we didn't have a womanist on the Charlotte campus. And I include womanist texts in every single class I teach, whether it's Dr. Lynn Westfield or Dr. Stacey Thomas Floyd or Dr. Cannon's own text, Dr. Sims. These are the stories, these are the perspectives of people who are other than what our normative culture would say this is the experience. And in that wrestling and helping students create space for that dissonance, to create space where it's okay to have to wrestle with and not feel comfortable with this in the beginning, but you have to stick with it, because Dr. Cannon invested in every student, regardless of where they came from or who they were. I know that issues of class were brand new to me, and they shouldn't have been, as someone who is first generation college student out of Appalachia, but it was. So we all have something to learn, but we have to be willing to sit as white women, as feminist liberationists, as part of the dominant culture. We have to be willing to sit in some discomfort until we figure out how we not just live together, but how we rejoice and truly be free together.
I see some really beautiful remarks and responses to both of you in the chats that are bubbling up. Reverend Dwylene Butler says, Dr. Cannon was such an affirming professor. She would not allow anyone to see themselves as inferior, nor anybody else. Mm-hmm. Dr. Cheryl Kirk-Dugan, who also has joined us, I see a beautiful chat here where she says, Dr. Katie was and is incredible. She lived, breathed, shared a loving pedagogy, She knew how to listen with empathetic love and affirm one's gifts and pressed us all to do the work our soul must have. I think that's an important way of thinking about this in the context of the gifts that she brought to any understanding, I would argue, of womanism. And Dr. White, you talked early on, real, recognize real, in a way that I would think that did not just think about womanism as only a kind of academic approach, but also pointed to some of the more ways in which we might think about the embodiment, right? How did Dr. Cannon bring not just an academic understanding, but also somewhat of a folksy understanding in her centering of womanism? Dr. Rochelle. You're muted. Yeah.
Most prominent are the stories of Dr. Cannon. Her personal experience being brought up in the 50s, going to a Lutheran kindergarten, as she had said in the video, at age 3. Society was segregated. They couldn't go to the parks, couldn't go to movies, couldn't go to theaters. And even then, she asked the theological question, which most people probably didn't think it as theology. What did Black people do that was so bad that they can't be a part of society? And so I think through her narrative, her personal narrative, that she would always share her narrative as a means of people understanding it from a folksy, as you said, perspective. I also, in addition to her narratives, Dr. Cannon had a way that was speaking that was gettable. She could speak in academies when she needed to, but she spoke gettable language. Like she incorporated lines from hymns, rap music, spirituals, song lyrics, R&B, parables, jokes, anecdotes. And I think all of that helped to bring the personal aspect of womanism that people could understand and get.
That makes me think about one of her kind of biggest contributions to womanist theological ethics is literature. And her kind of willingness to source the works of the fabulous, one of the most fabulous Black woman writers of 20th century, Zora Neale Hurston, but Toni Morrison and so many others that provide to us this, what she calls a repository of Black women's traditions. So storytelling, I believe, was a part of one of her gifts as well. We are all ordained women. And I know folks who are joining us are also people of faith. We can talk about this in terms of transformation for the academy, but how does Cannon's witness give us a model for transformation in the church? Dr. Davis, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. One of the things that I know there's so many, I can't say what I'm most admired. There's not a single thing about her that I didn't admire and didn't touch my life and didn't change me fundamentally at the core of who I am. But she bridged the academy and the congregation in a way that not many on either side do. So often those in the academy just stay there and stay in a tower and stay in theory, or in those who are practitioners, just stick there and what works and what's expedient. And look, we've done it this way before, so we're just going to do it. And she bridged it. She found value in both the academy and the congregation. And there was an expectation that both had meaningful contributions to bring to the other. I also think that she taught us how to be courageous and to not give up, to not at the first hurdle. There was a moment early in my PhD experience when a professor who's ink was not quite dry on her own PhD, wrote a comment on a paper that said, "You write for the congregation, and that's not good enough for the academy." And I went across the street and went up to Dr. Cannon's office and just, knocked on the door and burst into tears and said, "I guess I have to leave the program. I'm not good enough." And she said, "Sister Becky, sit down." She said, "Has anybody ever taught you how to write for the academy?" And I said, "No, ma'am." And she said, "Come with me." And for 2 hours, she taught me how, on a blackboard on the second floor of Watts in one of those small classrooms, how to do the what, how, why, and turn the congregational truth and beauty into the academic language where it would be respected and known. And I will be forever grateful for that and so many other things. But she wasn't going to let anyone discount either side, the congregation or the academy. And she taught us how to be fierce.
I heard so much from what you said. Just her approach. I mean, calling you by your name. She would be Sister Becky, Reverend, soon to be Dr. Melanie,
Yeah.
all the time, making sure that she outlined all of the ways by which you were connected to her just by encountering her. But what you did there was translation as well. I think, Dr. White, Rochelle talked about historical ethos, embodied pathos, communal logos. And in the church, those questions can be translated to what, how, and why.
That's right.
What is happening here? What's going on? How did we get here? And fundamentally, why is it happening?
Yeah.
And I think those are excellent ways by which we might think of that as translatable in our context, because a lot of our questions in terms of power, in terms of class, in terms of race, are really, if we follow the lines of asking, what is this? What is really happening? How did we get here? And why? We might be able to press us towards transformation in those communities for sure. Dr. Rochelle, I don't want to cut you off. Did you want to respond on Cannon's import for the church?
I think one thing that we can look at Dr. Cannon personally is her humility. Even though she was Dr. Cannon, world-renowned womanist theologian, Christian ethicist, she was also humble in that she sat under the leadership of a Black woman pastor. Just the fact that she could have gone to church, she could have had a church, but she submitted herself to woman's leadership. And I think that was one of the things about Dr. Cannon that really impressed me in terms of ministry in the church, or how do you serve in the church? As an academician, the academy that's what we do. And sometimes I find it difficult to translate back to the church for a variety of reasons. But I can always follow her example and sit under the leadership of someone in a church and grow and learn from them. So I think that's one of her transformative ways of being.
Yeah, I think it really levels the playing field and kind of pushes against this hierarchy that certain spaces or certain people or certain credentials give you a certain kind of knowledge. But rather, we are grateful for the knowledge that we learn in the academy, but we're also recognize that there is a multiplicity of embodied knowledge, and that must be shared in community as well. I think you both pointed to what I would say is Cannon's canonical virtues: invisible dignity, quiet grace, and unshouted courage. But that courage is really special and a gift that I think most students need, simply to be encouraged, but also to get a measure of courage in order to face whatever is before them. I want to invite folks who are joining us online. I see still beautiful responses. Leonard Etlow talking about Dr. Cannon's experience of even sitting outside the classroom, even as at a Black seminary, recognizing the ways in which there was gender discrimination, even in homogenous spaces, or her being challenged because she was a storefront pastor, even while working on her PhD, which already tells about her interconnections in terms of having great kinds of interest to merge town and gown, but to merge certainly the academy also with conversations in the community and the church. Here's a question I have. I spoke earlier about these CRT discussions or conversations about the censoring of African American studies. How might Dr. Cannon show us ways to center the often silenced Black experience, either in our pedagogy or just the necessity of centering that in our work?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Cannon was a truth teller.
Yeah.
And you alluded to that, Reverend Melanie, when you said, even when they call your truth a lie, tell it anyway.
Tell it anyway.
And I think that she centered the Black experience even 20 years ago for me almost, by including textbooks and resources that were required, that were centered on the Black experience. So I think that was her way of having us tell it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it may not have been very loud or vocal, you know, telling the truth, but we're getting the truth when we're reading those resources and doing assignments. So I think just the way that she included a Black text, a text centered on the Black experience in every course. I went back and looked at all my syllabi, you know, just to check to make sure. And it was there that there were texts, every class centered on the Black experience.
Dr. Sadler asks a question. So what would Dr. Cannon have to say about Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder? How would she imagine womanism influencing this movement?
I would think that they are interrelated, that in some ways, I don't know that you could have a Black Lives Matter movement without the trailblazing work that Dr. Cannon and other womanist ethicists and scholars have done. I think that her work, I think that it helps us make sense of what's happening in the world, but also to help us to stand and say no. That we will not stand for this. Yes, she has given us the theories and the words and the pedagogical strategies that we can use in our context of ministry, whether that's congregation, classroom, streets. But she's also given us the moral imperative that we cannot stand on the sidelines. And I think that that's how she would respond, and I think that's how she's influenced us, is she's shown us in her example, and she's given us in her writing the courage and the expectation that this is not okay and that we can do better.
I see a question from Janet Mullins in similar fashion. How would Dr. Cannon address the hurt and the pain of the Me Too movement? Dr. Rochelle, you want to take that one?
I think she would first call our attention to who we are as women and our value and our worth. And again, it's not something that she's not done already. You know, in her writing and in her lectures and in her preaching, you know, she has addressed the value and the worth of women in those ways. So I think it's just for us now to take what because Dr. Cannon is no longer physically here with us, but we are her legacy. And so I think it's for us to take what she has taught us to be the healing balm for those who are afflicted and inflicted through pain and abuse.
We've been talking about methods, tenets that were popular and that remain in terms of Cannon's conversation in womanist theological ethics and in pedagogy. The tenets of appropriation and reciprocity. How do you understand these tenets as useful for liberative strategies in the church and society?
Well, I think that the reciprocity piece, I mean, I think that as white educators, as white pastors, as white women, we need to be very careful about appropriation. We can never fully understand our sisters' full experience. But the reciprocity piece there is we have to show up. We have to bring our stories and who we are and put them in conversation and in relationship, not just a classroom academic from the head up, as we said earlier, but how do you create true, deep friendships and relationships so that we can see one another and hear one another and honor one another and find deep joy in one another and in these relationships. And I think that those are not pedagogical strategies or tenets that we often tend to in more traditional or white ways of teaching. And I think Dr. Cannon just wasn't going to stand for anything less than this full humanity and full self.
If I could add, I was having some trouble with the term appropriation as well, and how it can be valuable in today's context. And so it led me to think about the word appreciation more so than appropriation, that I can learn to broaden my perspective and connecting, like Dr. Davis said, in relationship. So the whole concept of appropriation, and because what it stands for, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way, or how we see it operating, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But I was able to come to a resolve with the whole idea of appreciation and reciprocity.
Vicky Simple Melson asked this question: how would Dr. Cannon help people in predominantly white churches to see racial justice as an essential aspect of Christian discipleship, especially in light of the current CRT controversy and some state restrictions on teaching inherently divisive concepts in public education?
Well, I think that I think Dr. Cannon would, she just walked this amazing line between expecting you to do the hard work, and yet accepting and loving you when it was a struggle. And so I think that this, it's at the beginning of the short documentary that Union New York did on Womanist. And there's that opening clip where she says exactly what you said, Reverend Melanie, tell your truth, speak your truth, even when no one believes you, even then. And I think those of us who have had the privilege of learning from, and those who are still learning and wrestling with what it means to be a part of a dominant culture that is so scared in this moment that it wants to shut down conversations. It puts an extra heavy burden on us to stand up and to say no, and we are going to speak this truth. And especially if as an educator, if public schools are not going to teach critical thinking, are not going to teach CRT, are not going to teach this story, then it is absolutely incumbent upon us to teach this kind of social justice in comfortable congregations. It's up to us to incorporate this into our Christian education, our faith formation, congregational work. Because if society, how else will we foster the courage in our people to be faithful witnesses in this struggle, in this battle?
Mm-hmm. Dr. White, this is directly from Katie's Canon. And if you want to purchase that, the new revised version is out with Fortress Press. But she asks this question, quote, "What are the essential liberating strategies that African-American clergywomen use in their own sacred rhetoric that will continue to encourage an ethic of resistance?" I think this is important to ask both on the side of recognizing there's some work for our white sisters and brothers to do, but there's also, and siblings to do, there's also some work that we must continue to do in terms of Black women in order to push against these systems and powers and structures.
One thing that Dr. Cannon offers is womanist biblical interpretation, to consider it as a form of understanding the issues surrounding gender, race, and class, and the theological problems that we encounter because of those three items. So we need to read and explore biblical scholarship by womanist writers. And that's not to say that that replaces our study of the biblical text, but it informs us and helps us to see how they're writing in the original text, the language, wording, looking at patriarchal structures, because interpretation informs how we preach. You know, people want to know what we're talking about. And so there are some biblical scholars, and I can't name them all, so I may get in trouble for naming some, but I'll say Dr. Renita Weems, Dr. Mitzi Smith, Dr. Kimberly Russell, Dr. Will Gaffney are a few who have put out excellent resources in terms of womanist biblical scholarship, both Old and New Testament. And then Dr. Cannon also mentions not just considering womanist biblical interpretation, but thorough sermon preparation. We got to work at putting our sermons together. Dr. Cannon used to quote her mentor, Dr. Isaac Rufus Clarke, and said, "Preaching is a divine activity wherein the word of God is proclaimed concerning contemporary issues with a view toward ultimate response to God." And so that means we need to engage in in-depth exegesis, looking at how scripture and our interpretation of it dismantles structures of race, class, and gender. We have to be aware of what's going on in the world, as well as what's going on in people. So first is womanist biblical interpretation to be considered. Second, thorough sermon preparation. And third, use language that is gettable. I think I said that before. Dr. Cannon said, what good is your preaching or your teaching if people can't understand it? So she says that preaching has to be accessible to our listeners.
Yeah, I think those are phenomenal resources and strategies. It reminds me, if any of you have been able to check out Walking Through the Valley, Dr. Weems's first article in that text is The Biblical Fields Lost. Speaking of Dr. Cannon's kind of rejection or ousting, she had first entered Union Theological Seminary, wanted to do a PhD in biblical studies, and was kicked out of the program because she wasn't deemed a serious student, and turned around and it became ethics gain. So certainly she was serious, more than serious, for this work. But that is essential in terms of valuing our womanist biblical scholars and looking at the ways in which womanist biblical interpretation enhances the work we do. Dr. Cannon is also very informative in terms of preaching. She wrote a book, Teaching and Preaching, which lays out Isaac Rufus Clarke's model, but also provides us with a kind of pathway by which we might think about our own sermon preparation. And then certainly making it plain was essentially one of her biggest interests, to be able to communicate, transfer, translate knowledge across communities. I want to open it up. We are coming to our time here, and grateful for the time that we have had with each other. But I want to open it up to you. If there are any final thoughts or things that you want to leave with our community tonight, to remember about Dr. Cannon, or even to take with us forward.
I'd share a memory on Dr. Cannon. So in early of spring 2007, I drove Dr. Cannon to Duke Divinity School because she had a lecture. And so we rode to Duke, stayed overnight. On our way back home to Richmond, we stopped at a rest stop. And so I checked my email, and I found the news that I thought she might want to hear. And so we got back on the road again. And I said, Dr. Cannon, do you want to know who the president of Union Seminary is? She says, probably some shriveled up white man. I said, Dr. Cannon, do you want me to tell you who the president of Union Seminary is? She said, all right, Sister Rochelle, who is it? I said, it's Dr. Brian Blunt. In her mouth, and she reeled back, and she was just amazed as I was amazed. And one thing I want to remember about that trip is, after we learned that Dr. Blunt was going to be the president, we rode home in silence, because we knew that change was coming to Richmond in the form of the first Black president. And so I will always cherish that memory.
That's a beautiful moment. It really is. Yeah, my, I alluded to the fact that I don't come from a family that valued education or religion or any of that. But my dad had heard me talk about Dr. Cannon so much that he said one day, I want to meet your Dr. Cannon. Now, as someone from Appalachia, I immediately became nervous. He was not the most enlightened human being, though he was a good human being. And the occasion happened that he came to visit, and we went up to the second or to the third floor of Watts. And there was a part of me that was praying that maybe she wasn't in her, or it wasn't in her office. But she was. And I said, Dr. Cannon, this is my dad, and Dad, this is Dr. Cannon. And she reached out and hugged him. And she said, I hear you like my homeboy. And I thought, oh my Lord, he's not going to know what that is. Oh, where is this going? And he immediately said, yes, I really like Dale Earnhardt. And I don't know which caught me off guard the most, that Dr. Cannon knew Dale Earnhardt, or that that here was this moment. And she had this way of transcending background, people, social location. It wasn't about the way the world labeled and constructed people. It was about the heart of who each person was and connecting with that. And she transcended every single possible line and barrier that the world could throw at us.
Wow. Tonight has been so phenomenal. I think there is so much to be said about Dr. Cannon, but more importantly, what she leaves for us is an amazing legacy through her students. And we're grateful for the work that you two are doing in your respective capacities as teachers, as leaders, as ordained clergywomen, as now mentors, and so many ways in which you're contributing to not only the academy, but also the church. And we are grateful for your work and scholarship and how you continue to make the connections with Dr. Cannon for all of us. We are richly blessed by all of you that have joined us tonight for conversation. We do not take it lightly, the time that you spend with us, even though the hour seems as if it goes so quickly. We are grateful that we get this time to share with you. And we want to say that the work of Dr. Cannon continues. In many ways, it is reflective in the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership through our programming that we bring to you alongside Just Talk monthly in terms of these virtual webinars. But more concretely, we're headed to Charlotte this spring, April 13th through the 15th, with fabulous womanist speakers, thinkers, there at the Sheraton Charlotte Airport Hotel. If you have not registered, you can go to our website at centerforwomanistleadership.org. That will give you all of the information that you need to know to get registered. I can tell you that we have some fabulous speakers on the roster. Folks like Trisha Hersey, who is known to many of us as the Nat Bishop, Stacey Foy Thomas, and Allison Guys Johnson, and LaVon Briggs, and so many more. So if you have not gotten your ticket, get registered. You can join us in person or join us online. Tonight, as our closing, we'd like to hear the words from our dear brother, Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, as he remembers Dr. Cannon's legacy. Thank you all.
So Dr. Sadler, tell me a little bit about your relationship with Katie Cannon. Tell me something and share with us about Katie Cannon.
Yeah. Dr. Cannon was a wonderful colleague, and I think that we need to know that. She was not just a great figure that loomed large in the ether. She was a wonderful, down-to-earth colleague, the kind of person that would check on you to find out how you were doing, would give you guidance and instruction. Sometimes she was like a big sister and would rib you and mess with you and play with you. Other times she was like a mother who would nurture you and encourage you in different ways. So she was an incredible human being. And I think that that should not be lost as we talk about her as this iconic figure. She was very much a real person who had a real influence on so many different lives. I can't remember the joy that I felt when I realized I'd be joining a faculty that she just joined a couple years before I came on. And just to be able to sit at her feet to learn from her and Sam Roberts as they were here, it was an incredibly generative time at the Seminary for Black Theological Ethics. And just to get to know her over the years, she was quite a gift, and she will always be missed. Getting to know her also meant getting to know her brother, Jerry, getting to know her mother, and having her mother as an intimate part of my life as well over the years. So she's quite an incredible human being who did so much. She was such a groundbreaking figure in so many ways. The first Black woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church, the first woman to graduate from ITC, the first Black theological ethicist that we have. I mean, she was such a groundbreaking pioneer that, again, we should never forget who she was, what she did, and just how she was a down-to-earth girl from Kannapolis, North Carolina, who never let those roots go.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler, and thank you all for watching. Save the date for our next panel discussion on New Testament interpretation, Tuesday, April 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.